Good morning and welcome to Coffee and the Word. So we've been starting over, if you will. We started in Genesis chapter 1 and we talked about how God took chaos and made order, and we talked about God creating us in his own image, and then we got into the fact that, sin kind of showed up with the serpent tempting Eve and the things that go on there. And then yesterday we saw the effects of sin and how it continues to unravel us, if you will. When we talked about the fact that sin is crouching at your door, but you must rule over it. And I love that sentence, because I do believe a lot of times we come to the conclusion that sin rules us and we can't rule over it. And so today I want to focus on the question that Cain asks God when God asks him, "Where is your brother Cain?" And I kind of alluded to this yesterday, but God oftentimes will ask questions that he already knows the answer to give us the opportunity to get right. And we often, at least historically speaking and biblically speaking, respond to his questions that he already knows the answer to with some sort of rebuttal question or accusation. And so in verse 9 of Genesis chapter 4, the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know." "Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, you were with me yesterday, so you know that Cain knows exactly where Abel is. He knows exactly what happened to him. What's interesting to me is I don't know if Cain has deluded himself into believing that God doesn't know, or if Cain is not willing to face the truth yet. You see, that happens to us a lot of times. We sometimes just aren't ready to face truth. We live in our deception. Our deception becomes our truth to some degree. But he asks an interesting question in all of this. He asks God, "Am I my brother's keeper?" And I want to hang out here for just a second, because I want to ask a couple of questions. How would you answer that question? Are you your brother's keeper? Jesus tells a story, or is asked a question, what is the greatest command? And he answers, he says, the greatest command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind. And the second is like unto it, love your neighbor as yourself. And after he washes the disciples' feet, he tells his disciples to go and do likewise to one another. And you'd be hard-pressed to study New Testament scripture and not run across this phrase, one another. One another is used over and over and over again. Our interpersonal relationship is a huge part of our growth, is a huge part of our faith. And I don't know when it started, but somewhere along the way, we got this impression that your faith was a personal endeavor. In fact, you've probably heard it. You've heard people say there's two things you're not supposed to talk about: religion and politics. We should just keep our conversations light and airy. We should talk about, more important things like the best TV show on, or YouTube video, or some TikTok we watched. And that's kind of what I think we've reduced ourselves to. We attend churches, we don't belong to churches. We show up and do things, we show up to be filled, we don't show up to fill. And so when Cain asks this question, "Am I my brother's keeper?" God doesn't really answer that question here. In fact, God just kind of calls him out for what already happened. But I want us to answer this question. You are, in fact, your brother's keeper. And what that means is you are to be looking out for the best interest of your brother. You ought to consider their thoughts and opinions more valuable than your own. You ought to be serving one another and being hospitable towards one another and loving one another and rebuking one another and encouraging one another. In fact, one of the things that we're told in Hebrews 10 is that we should not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but stirring one another up for love and good works. We're called to edify one another and sing and teach one another. But I'm going to be honest with you, we're almost in the am I my brother's keeper? Or maybe a better way to say it today is you're not my keeper. It's almost in the reverse, is we don't want people intimately involved in our lives. We don't confess our faults one to another. We walk around pretending we've got it all together. You are your brother's keeper, and you need your brother to keep you. This is something that I feel so passionately about. I don't know how I make it without people who call me out, people who challenge me, people who make it, me very uncomfortable when they speak truth into my life. It's how I become better. And so when Cain asks this question, he's trying to avoid what he thinks is a bigger question. What did you do to Cain? What did you do to Abel? But man, this question rings so true to me. We've reached a place in our lives where we hide our lives from the people that we ought to be sharing it with. We pretend that we're okay and everything's fine with the people we ought to be confessing our faults to. Am I my brother's keeper? Yeah, you really are. There's a passage over in Galatians where Paul is talking about Peter. And Peter was doing some stuff that Paul knew was wrong. And I love what the scripture says, I withstood him to his face because he was wrong. And I'm sure that was a difficult situation for Peter to be in. But I'm also sure that Paul was helping Peter become who he was supposed to be. Iron sharpens iron. We need one another. And we should be keeping one another. We should be checking in on each other. We have more resources today to be able to do that than we've ever had. And yet we're less likely to do it than we've ever been. So here's my challenge to you. Why don't you go love on some people today? Check in on them. Tell them you're there for them. Ask them with the real intent of understanding how they're doing. How are you really doing? I'll never forget one of my youth came to me a while back and they asked me a really interesting question. They said, how is your walk with Christ? And I thought, what an interesting question that we never ask. So how's your walk with Christ? Am I my brother's keeper? Oh, you bet you are. And he's yours. And you need that. And I need that. I hope you'll find a way to begin to do life with people instead of doing it by yourself and pretending with people. I know you have some close friends, but you need a fellowship. Anyway, I hope this helps. Tomorrow we'll dive into what God says to Cain and what happens to Cain. But for now, I really, really kind of want us to really ponder the idea that we're supposed to be in this together. We're supposed to be strengthening and encouraging one another daily. Let's start doing that. For now, this has been another edition of Coffee and the Word.